won't hide to break apart. Don't tell me why I can't collide. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel it? On the break of dawn, I'll follow you to carry on. On the break of dawn, I'll follow you to carry on. Till the break of dawn.
Got a monster inside of me, you better watch out. If you ain't got enemies, I'm road ahead of full prophecy. To be the greatest beast the world has ever seen. I feed him every day like the bones clean. I feed him all the hate and he grows me. And he gets cause real big, gets off quick. And if you cross him, you might drop dead. Metaphorically, of course, settling the score. Never getting bored, lots of blood and gore. Always wanting more, freedom from the source. They don't really understand until they feel it worth the party. And if you start shit, you be hard lived in the darkness. Torn apart quick, you left scars ripped. You be chewed up and discarded.
And this world ain't right, won't accept it. Negative energy, I expect it. Once it's in your mind, it's infectious. So fight for your life and reject it. You better give me space, I'm protective. My adrenaline spikes when I'm threatened. And if you stay in my way, I'm aggressive. Cause when there's no exit, I'll kill when I'm desperate. When there's no exit, I'll kill when I'm desperate.
Pump up the bass line.
Wait!
Pump up the pump up the
vision. Straight up, man, just gotta make a decision. Stay focused, man, I gotta go. Can't be going backwards, I can't be going slow. Gotta take the lead and I gotta steal the show. It's a straight up madness, you know how we roll.
How's everyone going? Welcome everybody. Those of you that are here, well, about 30 odd, maybe 40. Thank you very much for tuning in. It is what is it? Thursday afternoon. So I don't expect many people to be around, but hey, I thought I've got nothing else to do. So why not waste my time doing this? So today, interesting enough, if you've tuned into a couple of my live streams, you would have probably come across Paul Politic down here. And he always makes videos around a range of different political issues, primarily based around New Zealand. And the reason why I like to bring him up is because I'm someone that thrives on talking about opposing views, views that are just very much inconsistent with mine. And that's something that he smashes out of the park constantly, but often they're about relatively important issues or issues that I think really open up the space for robust discussion. And so that's why I like to bring it up, because it poses the question. It allows you to get involved if you really want to, but also because I just find some of the beliefs he holds to be completely laughable. And I think that just brings joy to my day. And so, of course, What is a Woman came up. And if What is a Woman's going to come up, then I kind of have to cover it, because there is nothing like listening to a lefty explain what a woman is. And I have no idea what he's going to say here. Maybe he's actually onto it. But I thought this is where we should start today. I am just checking that the chat is working all good, folks. It's not clear if it is or not. So if you do want to help me out and just spam the chat with stuff, that'd be extremely useful. As you can see, I'm dealing with a slightly new look right now, which I think is, I certainly can't complain with it. But yeah, of course, that means shuffling things around and seeing that everything is working all okay. But for the meantime, I'll pull this up and I'll just probably get straight into it.
What is a woman? This has become a favourite question of the political right. They made a documentary about it. They have asked countless politicians this question. Many right-wingers copy and paste this question as their go-to response. Like mindless bots, they repeat it again and again. They like this question because it relates to transgenderism, a subject that they have an unhealthy obsession with. The right-wingers argue that a woman is simply an adult human female, a
Yes, that's exactly what the dictionary says, sir.
biological category. They ask what is a woman, hoping to get one of two answers. Either you give this answer and exclude transgender people, or you give a convoluted reply and they mock you for it. This is not a genuine question. It is never uttered in good faith. It is a simple rhetorical point that has been dispersed top-down by right-wing propagandists online.
See, I would argue that it very much is asked in good faith, because the only people that are talking about this subject in bad faith are those who reject the definition of the word. So, for example, a woman is very much, by dictionary definition, a biological human female, right? That's just a fact. I mean, gender is a way that we express differences in human. So, for example, there's a difference between boy and man for a reason. A boy is a biological human adolescent or child. See, there are differences in what we use. I'm not going to call a 30-year-old a boy unless I'm trying to be demeaning. So, there is a very specific reason for this, because words have meanings, and we can't just reject them because we want to include people.
Fine. Today I want to devote a small amount of time to this question. What is a woman? Of course, the intuitive answer is an adult human female, but think about it for just a moment. It makes no sense to regard woman as an exclusively biological category. Like most people, I know numerous women. I do not know what chromosomes or genitals they possess, but I recognize them as women nonetheless.
Just because he chooses to recognize someone as a woman regardless of their genitals and regardless of their chromosomes, that doesn't mean he's recognizing them in a factual way. I could look at a cow and mistake it for a horse, that doesn't necessarily mean that cow is suddenly a horse. Or just because I want to look at that cow and think it's a horse, that does not mean that cow is actually a horse. You see, the whole idea here is he's arguing that we should view gender as something more than someone being an adult human male or female, simply because he chooses to view others that way. That's postmodernist nonsense. And frankly, I've got no time for it.
Because woman is not simply a biological category. Woman is a social category. It is a label that comes with certain associations concerning identity, presentation, and behaviour. It is a
Actually, that's a revisionist opinion that really only exists in order to uphold this idea that gender is somehow some social thing. It's purely ideological and got no basis in fact whatsoever.
label that comes with a certain social identity. It is more than just a biological category. I think that anyone acting in good faith can recognise that. And of course the same is true of the concept of a man. These are not simple biological categories. People's social identities, social expectations and associations are heavily integrated into these very complex ideas. I repeat, I know plenty of men and women. I don't know what genitals or chromosomes they possess, but I regard them as men or women regardless, because this is not an exclusively biological issue. Personal identity, presentation and behaviour also play a role in identifying these things.
Except that's again false. This is just how you want to view the world rather than how the world actually is. You know, I'm not going to sit here and lie about the fact that I work with two transgender people. You know, and I've got no issue calling them, you know, by the pronouns they want or viewing them in a particular way because that's the, I don't know, the way that it makes sense to. In fact, one of them did a pretty good job. I had no idea they were even transgender until they told me. But, you know, it's not that I have an issue with them, and I've got no issue with them expressing themselves the way they do, but it doesn't mean I'm just going to sit there and pretend that they are biologically male or female, whatever way they happen to be, because that's not the truth. You know, if they want to go about their life, you know, posing this way or appearing this way, living this way, you know, in this case, let's say they want to be as much of a man as they possibly can whilst still acknowledging that they can't piss behind a tree as easily as I can, that's fine. You know, I've got no issue with them. They're a respectful person. I agree with them. I shouldn't say I agree with them, but, you know, I respect that they want to live this way. You know, but that doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, they are technically a woman. Well, not technically, they literally are a woman. And that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not going to sit here and shame them for, let's say, wanting to be a man or wanting to appear as a man, live as a man. I'm not going to shame them for that. I'm not going to take any issue with it because they're not impacting me negatively in my workplace. You know, it makes absolutely no difference to anyone else I'm working with. And so that's the fundamental thing here. There is a difference between being able to live with people who are transgender and who want to live in as much like a man or woman as they can, and then accepting that somehow this rejects what a man and woman are. There's a reason why there is trans in the name. Okay, there's a reason. And so we can acknowledge that trans men and trans women exist, but we can't pretend that they are identical to men and women. Okay? Like we can try and argue that it's all gender is all social, or at least the biological aspect is almost irrelevant, and that we should place emphasis on the social side of things or on the personal identity side of things. But no, I don't accept that. Because the very first thing you read when you read a man or woman is adult human, male or female. And given that fact, anything else cannot coexist with that if it's not consistent with it. So again, I will sit here and I will respectfully live side by side with people who are transgender, transsexual. That's fine, because unless they're going out of their way to make my life difficult or to make people uncomfortable, I don't care. Live your life. But I'm not going to sit here and reject the truth of what they are biologically, what the words that we're using mean, simply to appease them. Because right now, Paul, your argument is that we should reject the definition of these words because you yourself choose to view people a particular way. That's not how definitions work. I can choose to look at the sun and believe that it's not a gas, a ball of gas. I can choose to think that it's a ball of ice. That doesn't mean it's a ball of ice. Okay, and that's a stupid hypothetical, but so is the idea that we should just accept people are a man or woman just because they say they are, because they want to identify that way. Again, I'll reiterate, I don't care if you identify that way. I don't care if you want to live that way. But that doesn't mean you can dictate what words mean.
There is obviously a social aspect to what it means to be a man or a woman, and the right-wingers know this is the case. When they see a man in a dress, they will claim that they aren't a real man. If gender is just biology, this does not make any sense.
No, we say they are not a real man because we're bullying. It's just standard male bullying. See, just because men have expectations of what a man is, that doesn't make someone who is not acting as a man any less of a man in a literal sense. You know, I can watch Adam Lambert on stage, right, dressing however the hell he wants, whether he's in drag, whether he's dressing extremely feminine. You know, I might say, that guy is extremely gay, right? Or that guy is being extremely feminine. He's acting or dressing like a woman. He's sounding like a woman. I don't care. I'm a huge Adam Lambert fan, by the way. That does not mean he isn't a man. We all know he's a man. Okay? Just giving someone shit because they're acting a particular way doesn't detract from what they actually are.
But the right recognises that gender is about a lot more than just biology. They become incredibly obtuse on the transgender issue because being obtuse is the only way of justifying their mindless aversion to transgender people. And they try to treat this debate as a simple scientific issue. It is not. Many scientists recognise a distinction between sex and gender. Sex describes the biological.
Yeah, see, here's the argument he's trying to make. Firstly, he's trying to argue that we do this because we're whatever, right? He's just insulting right-wingers. But then he's also trying to argue that sex and gender must be different because some scientists think it is. Well, I'm sorry, but last time I checked, scientists didn't get to dictate things to us, right? Just because a scientist is labeled a scientist, that doesn't mean he's right or she is right. I find it insulting that we have to, or that people like Paul here expect us to just, you know, fall over and accept whatever a scientist says because he has a certain degree or whatever. I don't care. And after this video, we're going into a different topic that shows exactly why I don't care what any academic expert says. Because it doesn't mean they're right. Someone without a bloody law degree or without a degree in biology can prove biologists and lawyers wrong very easily, given the right topic and given ideological indoctrination. You see, here's the thing about academia right now. If you are left of center, you're very, very likely incapable of arguing a point objectively. Because I just haven't bloody seen it at all. I don't remember the last time I saw a left-wing academic be able to push ideology completely to the side. You see, I just haven't seen it. And they expect us to go about showing them respect and following the so-called evidence when they cannot put forward any points that are remotely based in fact, or at least aren't heavily influenced by political biases. What do you want from us?
Side of things. Chromosomes, genitals, all of that kind of thing. Gender describes the social side of things. The social identity, the associations and expectations regarding presentation and behaviour. These concepts are very valuable because there is undeniably a biological and a social element to these categories. Woman and female are not mere synonyms. Man and male are not mere synonyms. Why would we waste these terms as synonyms when we could break them apart to better grasp the complex world that we live in?
Except they are broken apart. That's why male is a biological human male, right? Or a biological human with XX chromosomes or whatever. Give me 1 sec. XXY, of course, is what I mean. I always get those mixed up. I always remember Y equals penis, just because it looks like that. Sorry, ladies. But male is a biological human with XY chromosomes, and female being the exact same with XX chromosomes. It's really not that complicated, and that's why we have male and female as words. And then, as I was saying earlier, we have gender for a reason, to break that down further. Man being an adult human male, right? An adult human. An adult kind of male. That's why boy is an adult, is a adolescent or child human male. It really isn't that complicated. And I don't know why why people try and make it complicated. Like, he's kind of understanding that there is a reason why we have these two different words, but he's rejecting why we have two different words and inventing some, I don't know, one of his own reason for why we have it, or he's just following along with what the gender academics or the gender ideologue academics claim. This difference in wording is for. And frankly, they're just full of it. Getting notifications about something, folks. No idea what it is, though. Oh well, that's alright. Sorry guys, I got a little bit flustered there. Let's continue.
Use one word to describe the social and the other to describe the biological. This enriches our understandings considerably. So what is a woman? The intuitive answer is an adult human female, but more accurately, we could say a woman is someone who identifies with a specific social archetype that is associated with the female sex. This is a potential definition. The disingenuous right-wingers regard it as madness when you contemplate this question for a prolonged period. But they do recognise that what it means to be a man or to be a woman is not all that simple. It is certainly not as simple as they like to pretend. We are talking about complex social ideas. Ideas that involve masses of behavioural expectations and associations, identities and archetypes. And as stated, the political right does recognise that this is a complex issue. They are perfectly happy to claim that people are not real men when their behaviour falls short of traditional standards. So obviously this is not simply a matter of biology. Gender issues are complicated, and we will all be better off when we accept that reality. Disingenuous gotcha questions are not helpful. The entire transgender issue is very frustrating. It has become a stupid culture war. The political right tries to direct contempt towards a marginalised group to distract from their disgusting anti-worker agenda. This is what they have been doing internationally. It is quite disgraceful.
This guy never fails to bring workers into everything he says. Absolutely every video, most of them. He'll somehow find a way to say, oh, this anti-worker agenda. I just don't get it, how he manages that. And quickly, GN just commented, thank you for addressing the BS narrative certain people are pushing. No problem. I mean, you can do it all day given how many people want it. How many people are doing it. Simon Anderson needs food, apparently. No. You're not getting any from me, Simon, that's for sure. So I think you're just going to have to suck it up and, I don't know, maybe go to a cafe or something. That'll be the closest you get, I think. But yeah, he sometimes always manages to bring it back to workers. But yeah, again, at the heart of this guy's argument is that biology and biological sex and gender just need to be separated because that's the way he wants to view the world. It's very much that simple. In fact, he even kind of lets it slip a little bit that what he outlined as a definition isn't the actual definition, it's a potential definition, but he wants us to view the world and live our lives as if this potential definition is the actual definition, despite that it's fundamentally inconsistent with the actual definition. Like, seriously. They want us to live a lie. And we're the bad guys for living in accordance with the truth. We're the bad guys. I'm sorry, Paul, but the only people here that have it fundamentally wrong are the ones that want us to adopt something that isn't even true.
Transgender people are surrounded by this mindless moral panic. Any minority rights project will always have some individuals who take things too far, but the amount of attention and hostility faced by the transgender movement is truly ridiculous.
The Batman 1119 says woman is an identity attributed to socio-cultural norms. Well, see, I would fundamentally disagree with that. Woman is a way of describing an adult human female. However, we often attribute certain sociocultural norms to them, in particular femininity. That doesn't mean they have to act that way, it just means that's generally what is accepted or the norm, although these days people aren't as concerned about how exactly you act as a woman, although we have, there's always people with preferences. I prefer a more feminine woman myself. If you're not, that's okay. Plenty of guys that actually like it. But, there is cultural norms. There are cultural norms. And then there is, let me explain this better. Just because there are exceptions to the rule, that does not prove, that does not suddenly mean that we just throw everything out of the cot and change how everything is. Right? The Batman says female is a sex trait. No, female is the sex. Okay? It's not a sex trait, it is the sex. Female is merely an adult human with XX chromosomes. Right? And that's the simple way of putting it. And a woman is an adult human female. That's just an objective fact, and if you don't like it, I'm sorry.
Just look at Trump supporters. They go on and on about how transgender people are supposedly degenerate, and then they endorse Trump, a sex offender who was close friends with Jeffrey Epstein.
And yet, you can bring up Jeffrey Epstein till the cows come home, and people can say, oh yeah, Trump was a huge friend of Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein knew pretty much anyone. Everyone and anyone powerful. And if we want to do a tally of whether Trump was closer friends with Jeffrey Epstein or the majority of the Democrats, let's not kid ourselves here. Okay, lots of people know bad people. Lots of people have been friends with bad people in history. That doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly they can be, smeared with the same brush. The Batman says, no, they are distinct, and that's a fact whether you like it or not. Well, unfortunately for you, it's not a fact, and I'm not particularly in favour of choosing to accept fantasies today. Not particularly a fan of that any day, but you see here, she's trying to say that people have an issue with transgender people, and they receive a bunch of hate that's, not really akin to much else. And this is really pushed by Trump supporters in particular. And of course, Trump supporters are bad because they support Trump, and Trump's all these bad things. And so you're just trying to make them all guilty by association and discredit them because they support Trump in the first place. And I'm just like, dude, that's not how you win an argument here. You're not going to win an argument by trying to discredit people by association, by supporting what is arguably the best president in the US since Reagan. Okay? Just because you want to live in a fantasy world where Trump's evil bad man, Orange Hitler, that doesn't make it true. Just like claiming that a woman is a man and a man can be a woman, that doesn't make it true either. Just because you want to view things that way doesn't mean we have to accept it. And obviously the Batman today obviously needs Robin to put him in his place.
The most notorious pedophile in recent history. It is embarrassing. And similar hypocrisy can be seen here. Some individuals on the political right in New Zealand are obsessed with transgender people. They fearmonger about grooming and child genital mutilation. Yet they
He mentions child genital mutilation as if that's like not a thing. That if it somehow, there aren't people who are under the age of 18 having bottom surgery in the world. We know it's happened. We know for a fact it's happened. Now, that aside, just because, sure, the cases of bottom surgery in minors is very rare, that does not mean it's not happening. And that doesn't mean we can't take issue with the fact that top surgery is happening very young. That doesn't mean we can't take issue with the fact that we're giving puberty blockers to 12-year-olds. It should not be that we acknowledge the mutilation of children, be that through surgery or puberty blockers and all that sort of stuff. It should not be that is an issue that we just turn a blind eye to. Because that's revolting. The Batman says, no, you are fundamentally misunderstanding. You are going to be, if you're going to be considered to know what you're talking about, you have to actually learn the sides objectively. We hate Trump because he's a rapist. There's not any good Trump policies. Okay, I actually do want to tackle this. If you're going to be considered to know what you're talking about, you have to actually learn the sides objectively. Okay, tell me, what is not objective about the claim that a man means adult human male? What's not objective about that? Absolutely nothing. It's an objective fact. You want me to adopt a position that's fundamentally inconsistent with what we know to be a fact. As such, we know one side, we know my side. My side happens to be consistent with the truth. And that's just the end of it. Then you would have to, if we want to extend that to Trump, you have the belief that you hate him because he's a rapist. The reality is you hate him because you listen to everything the media say and you know absolutely nothing about the guy apart from what the media says. And I mean, I could probably extend that to the fact that you're a anonymous person on the internet with a stupid name that has never had a critical thought in your life. That's just me being a little bit honest with you for a second. That's your side. My side is that, Trump has many flaws, but Trump has done a lot more good for the world in 4 years than, let's say, Obama or Biden did. But at the very least, isn't a warmonger, and that's a positive for everyone as far as I'm concerned. So you're saying there's not any good Trump policies. Well, I'm like, okay, let's look at what Trump actually did. He brokered the Abraham Accords for a start. That on its own is better than anything Biden did. In fact, all Biden did was, incite Russia to invade Ukraine. Let's just say, send a shitload of money to Israel for no particularly good reason. Although, of course, I am personally in favor of Israel remaining in Israel and not being booted out by, a swarm of Islamic extremist nations trying to boot them out. So as far as Israel being a force in the Middle East is concerned, I'm in favour of that being upheld. But of course, Biden hasn't really done much to aid that in any way whatsoever. And the ways he has gone about it is not politically popular right now. The Batman says, male is objectively describing someone's sex and man is describing someone's gender. It is social fact. No. Man is not describing someone's gender. Man is a gender. Okay? Let's put this in more simple terms. Rather than saying that it's describing someone's gender, let's say, okay, a man is one of two genders, and the definition of said gender is an adult human male. That's an objective fact. And you're also saying that is also what you are misunderstanding. I'm not getting my info from the media. If you can go ahead and research, there's courts, journalists, all a form, and a clip of him posting it. Yeah. Okay. So you get it. So you're not getting it from the far left media. You're getting it from the far left judiciary and far left academics. Good stuff. You made this account when you were 14, and Batman is a great DC character. Hey, why not get a new account? Not hard. But whatever, I don't care about your name. What I would recommend is maybe instead of bothering me, with a bunch of really great rebuttals, because they are the run-of-the-mill rebuttals that the average gender ideologue would make, perhaps go and educate yourself, or listen. Because you're just repeating the same old lies that we've been hearing for years and years and years. Remember, I was in high school just 10 years ago. Gender ideology wasn't a thing 10 years ago, at least in schools. Non-binary people weren't a thing when I was in school. Only 10 years ago. It wasn't a thing. So you can't come in here and tell me to just agree with everything you say. Because 10 years ago, it didn't exist. And most people in the world are older than me, and they know it bloody hell didn't exist. You are actually educating yourself by studying school. How do you study school? I studied school too. I found out that there are a bunch of ideologues who should not be anywhere near children. Because clearly, children are coming out like you. Batshit. I just got to be honest there. Simon's working, eh? Well, keep up the hard work, Simon. We wouldn't want you to get too lax. Anyways, I'll get back to the video because I think the Batman's had enough.
They have no interest in raising the age of consent and banning circumcision. If you actually want to protect children, these should be your policy priorities. I have myself repeatedly advocated these policies. But instead, the Conservatives never mention these policies and ramble about transgenderism constantly, because it has nothing to do with protecting the vulnerable and everything to do with mindless, irrational hate. The transgender issue...
You see, the thing is, right, his narrative here is that the issue with that conservatives or the right wing have with transgender people is mindless, irrational hate. Have I, in the last half hour, given a single mindless, irrational, hate-filled argument or response? None whatsoever. I've acknowledged some simple facts. I've even shown some respect to people who I know to be transgender. But, you know, that doesn't mean I'm just going to roll over and accept something, right? It doesn't mean I'm just going to roll over and say, oh, yeah, no, that's true. Because you say so. Very quickly, the Batman says, yes, trans and queer people existed over thousands of years, even in Germany in the 1930s. You'll note I never said that trans and queer people didn't exist. I said non-binary didn't exist. There's a reason why I say non-binary, is because non-binary is quite literally the biggest bastardization and insult to transgender and transsexual people to have ever been made. You see, non-binary is quite literally for attention seekers or people who have a identity disorder and aren't getting the help for it. Because you're not a they, you're not a I kind of float with the wind in terms of my gender. I'm not gender fluid, I'm not this, whatever. Okay, it's one thing to say that you feel like you're in the wrong body. It's another thing to say that you are non-binary. That's something else altogether. That's really, I feel like, the personification of gender ideology is non-binary. But the fact that you're still in school does not surprise me whatsoever, because you sound exactly like the average person I expect to be in school right now. You are also echoing typical right-wing talking points. Yes, I am, because the right wing isn't batshit crazy. Well, so I didn't vote for Trump. As you can tell, I'm not exactly American, as you can see by the flag behind my head. I'm not American, so I didn't vote for Trump, and as such, he's not a danger to me. Nor did I vote for Christopher Luxon or David Seymour, because I'm not particularly a fan of them either, for my New Zealand audience. So, obviously, they're not a danger to me, even if I did vote for them. And Winston Peters most certainly is not a danger to me. Thank you very much. Psychologists and doctors also disagree with that. Any psychologist and doctor who thinks a man can be a woman does not deserve to be a psychologist or a doctor. So because I'm defending the right-wing position, and I haven't really defended Donald Trump at all here, other than to say that he's he's not some Hitler. I'm defending it, so somehow that makes me bad. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I sit here and defend the truth. I'm sorry that I won't bow down to this narrative that Trump is some fascist dictator. Take it up to those who are the professionals, and I'm going to get into more of that as the stream goes on. I've got absolutely no time and patience for professionals who reject objective reality. Because it doesn't matter what degree you've got, it does not matter. Really doesn't.
Issue is a complex issue, especially the medical side of it. Issues like women's sports also raise serious questions. But we can't have reasonable conversations because hateful right-wing idiots have made good faith discourse impossible.
You see, I'm the average right-wing idiot who tries to have discourse on this. The average right-wing idiot. And apparently I'm the one that makes having rational discourse impossible. Yet as far as I'm concerned, he's the one calling me a right-wing idiot. He's the one saying that, I'm just hate-filled, that somehow there's probably no objective reasoning to what I'm saying. No logic at all. As far as I'm concerned, he's the reason. People like him, people with his views, his way of going about discussing this issue, are the reason there is a breakdown when we try and discuss it. It brings me back to when I was at the second Let Women Speak event. What was it? 2023? It's like September or August or something. I went there because the women who just wanted to go there and chat about this issue that's important to them didn't feel safe because you've got a bunch of trans rights activists who were potentially going to assault them. And I'll tell you what, we had a police presence there, thank goodness, and the police were very much a barrier. Without the police, it's hard to know what they actually would have done, but they would have invaded the space and tried to clear them out. By touching them or not, likely just intimidation. They're doing their best they possibly could to intimidate as it was. But anyways, I went because, Simon Anderson, if he's still in the chat, was trying to get a couple of people together to film and also just to, help the women feel a bit more comfortable. And so, yeah, some people that were organising it wanted some, men to show up and just act as a little bit of a deterrent to any drama. So I came because I thought I've got nothing else to do. It'd be nice to meet a couple of people. And so I did. And I was pleased to be there because I could see the stark contrast between the group over here that somehow the idiot right-wingers who are impossible really to have a discussion on this objectively because we won't accept lies, versus the people that were down the bottom of this little area, screaming their heads off, getting all upset because women don't want men in their spaces. Goodness gracious. Phonicize says, modern intellectualism is a disease for idiots. Sounds about right.
Hate-driven morons have made it impossible to have a constructive conversation about these very important issues. Their bad faith rhetoric and hideous cruelty has made it impossible to talk about these issues in a considered and reasonable.
The Batman says, you asserting it as lies doesn't make it so, you have to build a case for it. If you haven't been paying attention, I literally built my case, argued my case, and rested my case in this very live stream. I mean, you just have to, I can literally go and type up the definition of woman, and it'll say adult human female, case closed.
Reasonable good faith fashion. Their vile prejudice has undermined the caution they pretend to promote. What should be a rational, considered issue has become a mindless, hate-filled cesspit, and the political right is largely to blame for this. So far, the political right has struggled to make this a mainstream cultural debate in New Zealand. New Zealand First has tried with little success, and that is a good thing. The last thing we need is to be consumed by the culture war stupidity that has absorbed the United States.
It's interesting, right? Pretty much, it's culture war stupidity because people hold a view he doesn't like. It really is. Because people are pushing back on a view he holds, it is culture war stupidity. It doesn't make sense. It's like, if any time we disagree on something that is a social issue is culture war nonsense, as that's more or less what's argued, then we're never going to achieve anything. And trying to diminish it as nothing but cultural nonsense that we should just put aside and just accept the left-wing narrative. Because, that's just not going to work. Because that's essentially what he's advocating for. If there is a culture war issue, then the left is always right. And as such, we should just adopt that, and that'll put it all to bed, and that'll end it all now. No. That's just nonsense. That's authoritarian. And that's actually rather arrogant. The left thinking that they know what's right because they're the kindness brigade, aren't they? All right. But anyway, this is his YouTube channel, Paul Politic. And as you can see, there's a very real reason why I like to come and watch the odd thing here and there and share it with you, because it gets me going. The Batman says, it is mainly because you can't comprehend progression or different ideologies. No, it's because progressivism is inherently regressive, and I know that because I understand different ideologies. Thank you very much. Now, this is quite a pivot away, but it's kind of, if you see the thumbnail, especially on YouTube, you'll know that this theme of today's stream is very much me taking issue with so-called experts, legal experts, and as you can see, the Batman in the chat here has a real soft spot for legal experts, because that's the basis of, his delusions. But that's okay. But, yeah, so what I brought up here is Dr. Dean Knight. If you don't know Dr. Dean Knight, he's, what is he? Is he a lawyer? I presume he's a lawyer. Yeah. Anyways, he put in a submission on the Treaty Principles Bill. And he's a prime example of why I take issue with, so-called experts. In fact, I left my own notes here that I'll quickly read before I go and break it down further. But essentially, he put in a 6 or 7 page submission on the Treaty Principles Bill. And it's just filled with utter nonsense, quite frankly. It's so-called, legal, what's he say here? He says, I am a legal academic at Victoria University of Wellington. And so obviously when someone calls themselves a legal academic and then can, kind of have the book thrown at them by me, it's not a good look. So he says, evidence that being a legal academic is meaningless. The fact academics can oppose equality in defense of racial separatism by arguing falsehoods is exactly why I have no interest in attending university. You claim the bill is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the treaty principles, stating they are not independent amendable norms, rather a legislative cue as to meaning. The problem being, the bill quite literally does the latter and rids us of the former. You flat out lie when you claim this bill effectively legislates a legal fiction. The only fiction is that the current crop of malleable principles that do not reflect the intention or meaning of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. The proposed treaty principles are a reflection of what Te Tiriti o Waitangi says, nothing more, nothing less. Finally, you state this bill undermines the separation of powers, but last I checked it was not the courts who write the law, it is they who interpret and rule on it. Treaty principles exist not because of the judiciary, but the legislature. Elaborating on a 50-year-old piece of law may change how the courts interpret it, but that's literally how the system is designed. The courts have absolutely no business dictating what the treaty principles are. So, I want to let you guys sit with that for a minute. And I will very quickly just go and check on the TikTok chat. Isa over on TikTok said, this person on the video sounds like Keller that calls into the platform. Interesting. I've got a feeling that Paul Politic doesn't call into the platform. And I've got a nickname called Cabin Boy, apparently from the Raider. Great to know. But anyways, nothing of much value over there. Anyways, getting on to this. We'll open it up. Goodness gracious, internet's a bit slow today. Crikey dick. I think it's more my PC more than anything else. It's got a lot of stuff open. A lot. Alright. Sweet. So, here's his bill, right? Here's his submission on the bill. 1. I oppose this bill. I wish to address the committee in person about this bill. I am a legal academic at Te Heranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and have written extensively about government and constitutional law in Aotearoa, New Zealand, including a recent textbook, The Constitution of New Zealand, a contextual analysis, co-authored with Justice MSR Palmer. What I like about the whole of a contextual analysis, the whole point of contextual analysis is that one could argue that all contextual analysis is inherently subjective, and that's why they're so effective at pushing the narrative. And that's why academics with a certain worldview, well, unless they can make a contextual analysis objectively, should steer well clear of it. And based on what I'm about to read to you, you'll see that he has absolutely no ability to objectively contextualize anything. There are many objections that may be raised to this bill. Not really. I wish to focus on its constitutional fidelity and likely ineffectiveness. However, I also share the sentiments of many who have expressed strong concerns about the nature of this bill and process of its development for more generally. The essence of my submission is that this bill is constitutionally misconceived for the following reasons. The bill is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the treaty principles, which are better understood as a legislative cue as to meaning, not independent amendable norms. Now, earlier when I quickly went over a few things that I wrote in my quote post about this, was that it does the latter and prevents the former. What I'm meaning here is he claims that this bill is a legislative cue as to meaning, or that the treaty principles themselves, I should say, are a legislative cue as to meaning and not independent amendable norms. But what this actually does as a bill is ensure that it's a legislative cue as to meaning by ensuring that we have actual meaning with respect to what the principles are. Because right now, we have legislation which just references that principles exist, and then you've got a bunch of people that are not involved in Parliament dictating what that meaning is. And so as far as I'm concerned, if the courts and academics are dictating the meaning, and not the people who are the only reason these principles exist in the first place, then we have a problem. And the reason why it's as much of a problem as it is because they have been inherently amendable. As in, I said they are malleable, did I not? And they're malleable in the sense that they have evolved over time in accordance with whatever academics and the Waitangi Tribunal in particular have thought the best to fit whatever the revisionist history of the day is. Wait, is volume on me way down? Seriously? I've got it usually at my kind of peaking. I'll turn it up a smidge. And so, yeah, I'll just rephrase that again. So, he says, the treaty principles are better understood as a legislative cue as to meaning. And so the best way we can go about that is by ensuring that the Parliament of the day puts into law what the meaning actually is. Therefore, the likes of the Waitangi Tribunal can reference and interpret what those meanings are. Because if we don't do that, then they're going to continue to amend the meaning of these words in accordance with whatever the hell they want. They have been inherently malleable over time. The Waitangi Tribunal themselves outline it as much. So his argument, his first point there, is just flat out false, and in fact the bill does the opposite of what he claims it does. The bill effectively legislates a problematic legal fiction by purporting to codify inauthentic treaty principles, colouring them with normative content that departs from their proper descriptive meaning. Now, I take issue with this because it really relies on the idea that the treaty principles that have been outlined by the ACT Party nonsensical, they've got no basis, they've got no relation to the Treaty of Waitangi at all, really, that they're completely inconsistent with the treaty, and that the current principles that we do use are very much consistent with what the treaty says, and any attempt to change them would in fact be an attempt to reject the truth and uphold a legal fiction. But in reality, it does the exact opposite. The current principles that we use are in fact a problematic legal fiction, and what is being proposed is as close to a literal representation of the Treaty of Waitangi that we have seen proposed to be implemented into law in our history. So again, the first bullet point he made was the other way around. The second bullet point he made is, again, the other way around. Because it's about looking at this objectively rather than focusing on a ideological fiction that has entrenched itself into academia. And he is part of the problem because he purports this nonsense, in fact teaches this nonsense to other people. The bill undermines the separation of powers by inappropriately purporting to oust or disrupt the interpretive function of the courts. It does not do that in any way whatsoever. If the Crimes Act is changed tomorrow, does that mean that the interpretive function of the courts is removed? Not at all. It just means what the courts are interpreting is different to what they were interpreting yesterday. This is no different. The courts don't dictate what the law is. They get to interpret what the law is. Parliament passes legislation. That's the job of the legislative branch, right? They create the laws. So in this case, the Parliament of 1975 created the law which outlined principles existed. So the Parliament of 2025, 50 years later, has all the power, has all the right in the world to outline what those principles are. Just because the judiciary has taken the responsibility of determining what those principles are up to date, that doesn't mean it's their right to. It just means they were doing so because Parliament hadn't done it. And Parliament has every right to do so now. So again, it does not undermine the separation of powers. It very much upholds the separation of powers, and preventing Parliament from passing this bill on these grounds would in fact be undermining the separation of powers. So once again, 3 bullet points, all 3 are back to front. The bill is based on a misunderstanding about the nature of the treaty principles, given the way it seeks to redefine the principles of the treaty while keeping the original source of those principles intact. Now, redefining the principles is a little bit... it's more complex than that. Redefining in the sense that they are saying all of the principles that we currently use are in the bin, and here are 3 key principles that reflect the treaty. No one should have any issue with that whatsoever. Sure, you could say it redefines the principles, but the principles shouldn't have power in the first place, but we're in a situation where they do, so we have to make the best of that. So in this case, sure, redefine the principles. Principles aren't really constitutionally protected. I suppose they are in a sense that it is part of our unwritten constitution, but it's not exempt from amendment. 6. Treaty principles are, in my view, best understood as the interpretation of the treaty, that is, the set of principles as a descriptive signifier of the pre-existing legal meaning of the treaty. And this is exactly my argument. What is being proposed is as much of a interpretation and a description of the treaty as anything else. In fact, it is the most accurate reflection of the treaty that has ever been proposed by Parliament, in the form of principles, that is. So he's literally arguing against what he says is his view, which is why these ideologues are just so captured. They can't even see common sense right in front of them. They can't even see what they want right in front of them when it's dangling there. They're going out of their way to oppose what they want. It makes no sense. It is often assumed that treaty principles are a set of norms independently created by Parliament, and are thus amendable by Parliament at will. However, in my view, the better way to conceptualize any reference to treaty principles is as an interpretive cue. In other words, a reference to principles of the Treaty of Waitangi is a signal from Parliament to the courts and the tribunal about how the original instrument, the treaty, ought to be interpreted. And in any event, this legislative cue most probably aligned and continues to align with the expected judicial and tribunal interpretation of the original treaty. anyway absent is any such reference to principles. So his argument here is that in his view, the treaty principles should not reflect the treaty literally. And in fact, they should not be something that, despite being a creation of Parliament, should not be something that the Parliament amends at will. Instead, what it should be is that principles should take precedence over the articles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and that unelected ideologues in our judiciary and academia should dictate what the treaty should be interpreted to mean. In other words, he wants to place people in his profession above those who actually are in control of making laws. He wants to place people in his profession above the will of the people. That's disgusting as far as I'm concerned. I don't think anyone should be making an argument that unelected ideologues, even people that can be as objective as possible, should be dictating what the laws are, or what we should view the principles to be, because whether he wants to admit it or not, the principles actually have an impact on our legislation. The principles have an impact on what laws can be passed, or what laws are very much open to scrutiny. You know, the principles themselves, the current ones that we have, are being used to argue against this current bill. You know, let's read this again. In other words, a reference to principles of the Treaty of Waitangi is a signal from Parliament to the court and the tribunal about how the original instrument, being the treaty, ought to be interpreted. I mean, that's utterly ridiculous. Imagine saying that we should not have this bill because, in my legal opinion, I would rather us dictate what it is than Parliament. As if that makes sense. Why would a treaty signed 185 years ago now? 185 years ago. Why would that be interpreted by so-called academics instead of the Crown? Seriously, why? Why would we leave that up for discussion in such a way? It should be very, very clear what the treaty is meant to mean and what that means for everyone else, because if it's not, that creates a bunch of problems, especially when many people in this country view it as the constitutional foundation of our nation. I mean, it's quite crazy to me that he's arguing that the treaty itself, what it says, is less important than how academics in 2025 want to interpret it. The existence of principles is merely a cue. The Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 is merely a cue to academics and the judiciary to interpret the treaty in the way they believe it should be. Even though I could sit here for the next half hour and explain exactly why their current interpretation is inconsistent with the text itself, and that is why this is a problem in the first place. That is why it needs to be rectified, and that is why we need these principles outlined by Parliament. Because if we don't, we'll continue to have academics, we'll continue to have the judiciary view this in a way that's inconsistent with the document that was signed. They are leveraging what we would interpret as the power and the authority of the Treaty of Waitangi, regardless of whether or not it has any power, because that's a whole different issue. They're leveraging it as a means to dictate how the country functions, and wanting to keep Parliament out of that. Wanting to keep the people of the country out of that. This broad equivalence between treaty principles and the meaning of the treaty is generally consistent with the origins of references to treaty principles, for example, as follows. The preamble of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975 refers almost interchangeably to the treaty and the principles of the treaty, including the tribunal making recommendations relating to the practical application of the treaty and determining its meaning and effect, as well as the practical application of the principles of the treaty. But again, the problem is you can sit here and say the practical application of the treaty, the practical application of the principles of the treaty, all you like, but if no such principles existed when they wrote that, that does not mean that forevermore the judiciary, the Waitangi Tribunal, and academics get to dictate and interpret that without any say from Parliament. That doesn't mean you get to shut out Parliament from being or clarifying that any further. Because that's what they're doing here. They're looking at the principles and saying, okay, we're going to clarify what these are to make sure that we live in a fair, free, democratic society that isn't going to be overrun by racial separatists who are currently getting a stupid amount of support in this country. The first legislative reference to the principle of the treaty can be traced to a preliminary draft of the Treaty Waitangi Bill adopted by Cabinet in April 1974, but with key references to the treaty being changed at the last minute to the principles of the treaty, they are bringing the reference in accordance with the Labour Party's manifesto, yada yada yada. That's just standard origin story of why the principles are a thing. It's the Labour Party's fault. Along with some concern, instruments, blah blah blah. During its passage of the Treaty of Waitangi Bill, the responsible minister, the Honorary Matiu Rata, Minister of Māori Affairs, spoke about the bill, giving effect to the government's acknowledgement of the importance of the Treaty of Waitangi to both the Māori people and our country. The manner in which Māori people had pressed for its formal recognition, which would enable the preservation of the spirit of the treaty and provide practical guidelines affecting Māori interest in perpetuity. And his government's belief that both the recognition and promotion of the full meaning of the treaty should be given statutory recognition. The issue with this is that the government of the day didn't outline what that should mean. And the fact that it was being left, and the idea that should be left to the courts and that forevermore the government should stay out of it, that Parliament should stay out of it, is nonsense. Because really his only argument against the government discussing this or dictating this is that there is either certain wording or that he thinks it's in the best interest, right? I mean, it's literally a piece of law that can be amended, so that wording's irrelevant anyway because you can just get rid of it. But secondly, it's of such importance that leaving it in the hands of academics and the judiciary, as far as I'm concerned, makes no difference, because what they're doing is they're making key decisions on the meaning of something which impacts our laws. It's not them interpreting law anymore. It's them literally changing how we go about passing laws. What laws can and cannot be passed, technically. I mean, the government could just overrule and do it anyway. That would be, that would cause a lot of drama. They're using this ability to amend the principles as they see fit, because that's what's happened in history. We can pretend it hasn't, but they have amended what the principles are and their meaning ever so slightly to get to where we are today. It is this exact thing which has led to a separatist movement in New Zealand becoming as strong as it is right now. The only way to nip that in the bud is to, well, frankly, outline that every New Zealander has the equal rights and duties under law. That we have one government, that the government has the right to govern over all the land of New Zealand and all the people within it. Robert Verstraeten says, the 1840 treaty has been reinterpreted by commies and weirdos. Well, yes, I agree. It fundamentally has. There is little evidence explaining why references to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi were adopted in the Environment Act 1986 and State-Owned Enterprises Act 1986, rather than references to the treaty. However, the parallel proposal to include the treaty, Te Tiriti Supreme Bill of Rights, evidences some of the then thinking about the treaty and how references to it might be interpreted, and again with the treaty principles, and almost the treaty and the treaty principles being treated as almost synonymous. And I'm okay with them being treated as synonymous so long as it's a accurate representation of what the treaty says. That's why I've got no issue with the Treaty Principles Bill, because it's proposing principles which accurately reflect what the treaty says. Legislating misinterpretations of the treaty in the form of inauthentic treaty principles would give rise to a problematic legal fiction. Legislating a legal fiction creates an interpretive conundrum for the courts. Judges would be forced to make a judgment about whether to apply the true meaning of the treaty or to give effect to the legal fiction about the treaty principles as legislated by Parliament. See, this is what I don't get. What is the arrogance of judges and this legal expert to claim, or legal academic, to claim that he knows better? He's claiming that what I've already outlined as being, and I'll prove later that this is the case, but who is he to say that what I have outlined as being the most accurate representation of the treaty in the form of principles this nation has ever seen proposed in the form of a bill, who is he to say that that is somehow going to put judges in the position where they have to choose between honouring this bill when it comes into the legislation, if it comes into legislation, and the so-called, actual truth of the meaning? Because this is the problem. The judges, the judiciary, the academics think that they dictate. They get to dictate what the true meaning of the treaty is. That they somehow know it. That it's just a God-given right for them to dictate it and know the truth, and everyone else is wrong because they are left-wing liberals or ideologues, and they know best. I could go to university tomorrow, do my law degree, which I wanted to do but decided against, and then I could leave and I'm a legal expert too. On paper. And I would have the fundamental opposite view to Dr. Dean Knight here. Except somehow his view's accurate, my view's inaccurate. And it's because they are ideologically corrupted en masse. And they think they get to dictate what things mean. Robert says, Māori are saying that the treaty is an agreement between two nations. It is clearly not. And this is the interesting thing here, is Robert's exactly right, to an extent. Not all Māori are saying it, of course. But it's clearly not an agreement between two nations. But what is interesting is how iwi, we also always think of iwi as being a Māori thing. It's more of a colonial invention, because it's easier to, sign over control of things when you've got larger groups that are signing it over. And so whilst we had, chiefs of Hapu as well as iwi sign these things, fundamentally Māori are better broken down into Hapu than they are iwi. But by creating, for example, the United Tribes of New Zealand, that meant that it just gave a sense of legitimacy to the signing of the treaty. It enabled the Crown to sign a treaty with a sovereign group of people, even though it was just this pocket of tribes, or Hapu, in the North Island. The He Whakaputunga, the Declaration of Independence, that enabled, as far as I'm concerned, a more legitimate cession of sovereignty in 1840, and that's what it was. It was a very, very smart play, in my opinion. But we don't ever talk about it that way. 1835 set the stepping stone, or set the agenda towards the cession in 1840. And by grouping people in a larger, grouping them into a larger group, it just made that all the more legitimate. It's a complex history if we really think about it, but also it's not that hard to get your head around when you take the time, just sit down, have a listen, have a read. It's quite clear. I mean, is it easier to get sovereignty over a nation if you've got 100 different iwi or 100 different hapu? Or is it easier when you just have to have a recognized group of, let's say, 10, 20, 30 iwi and hapu together, and they are regarded as sovereign or officially recognized as sovereign by, the British Crown? By doing that, coming in, getting those specific chiefs part of that union to sign a document which cedes the sovereignty, it just makes it all the more legitimate. Robert says, it is between one nation and a group of tribes who occupy one piece of land, who are all independent and often at war against each other. At the heart of it, that's true. But as I was poorly explaining just before, they did do the smart choice of having the United Tribes become a thing and recognize them as sovereign, so that when it came to 1840, the United Tribes, being a sovereign entity in the eyes of the British Crown, signed away their rights to sovereignty. So back to here, Dr. Dean Knight says, it is unclear how the courts would navigate that conundrum. The courts might apply the slated treaty principles as codified despite their inauthenticity. Again, he doesn't get to dictate what's inauthentic. As far as I'm concerned, what he believes in is inauthentic. Alternatively, and more likely in my view, the courts may continue to prioritize the treaty and its proper meaning over the inauthentic treaty principles. This priority may be justified by various orthodox interpretive traditions, including based on the principle of legality and constitutional character of the treaty, in light of the bill's internal inconsistency and its treatment of rights based on the interpretive direction in the NZ Bill of Rights Act 1990 to prefer rights consistent meanings as explained by Crown Law and its Bill of Rights Act advice on the bill. By analogy with the treatment of privative clauses which seek to oust judicial supervision of the government's understanding and of the compliance with the law, based on the simple reality that the treaty Te Tiriti itself is the original source of the treaty, related norms and meaning. Circumstances such as this could also see the principle of legislative supremacy start to unravel. This is what I find interesting, right? Is in the previous page, or in the A section, he was arguing that we should not be interpreting the treaty in accordance with what the treaty says, but rather with what the principles are. And so what should happen is the government should not create any principles, but the judiciary should and academics should. They should create principles based on how they decide to interpret the text of the treaty, irrespective of whether or not it's consistent, because as we already know, for anyone that's actually taken the time to look at this as objectively as they possibly can, they will know that the current principles are not a fair reflection of what the Treaty of Waitangi states. So we should reject what the Treaty of Waitangi itself states and what the articles say and break those down. So we should only accept what the principles as outlined by academics and the judiciary are. However, in the second part, in order to overcome this issue of the treaty principles that are being proposed not being consistent with the accepted academic and judicial view, we should now go back and interpret the treaty, or look at what the treaty actually says, as a justifiable reason to reject what is codified into law. So, on the first count, we should not accept what the treaty actually says and read it for what it says. We should accept only the principles. But also, in order to reject what the government outlines as principles and continue using what we want to use as principles, we should use the so-called actual text and the meaning that that bestows as justification for that. I mean, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that we should only use the principles as the reference point and not the text, and then go and say that we should use what the text says as justification to reject what the government's principles are, and instead continue to rule on our, whatever, Waitangi Tribunal cases and so forth in accordance with the principles that we outline, we being the, academics and judiciary. And so, yes, the treaty itself is the original source. And as such, we should in fact be basing how we interpret law related to the treaty and rule on cases related to the treaty based on what the treaty says. Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, even the preamble. We should be looking at exactly what that says, and that should be the foundation of any law related to the treaty. Anything related to the treaty. Any law, any decision, anything. But no. Instead, we're stuck with a bunch of principles that are malleable, that are used interchangeably, that, frankly, are a bastardization and a misrepresentation of the treaty itself altogether. But rather than accepting a new set of principles which would rectify that issue, no, we should claim that these new principles, which are a very, very, very fair representation of the treaty's text, we will claim it's the opposite. We will claim it's the opposite, and that's what he's doing here. He's claiming it's the opposite, and using this whole idea that the proposed principles are inconsistent with the treaty text, and that somehow the principles that are currently used are accurate, as a reason that this bill should not go through, because it would make utilizing or implementing this law, practicing this, if it goes through, impossible or implausible or unethical. It would put judges in a bit of a tight spot where they have to decide, are we going to rule based on the truth or based on a fiction? Of course, being in the postmodernist academic space that we are now, everything is opposites. Everything's opposites. He wants to uphold a lie by claiming that the truth is the lie, as he's done on every single one of these pages. The truth is the lie and the lie is the truth. We all have to accept it, otherwise we are the bad guys. And so, finally, he says, the bill effectively undermines the separation of powers by eroding the constitutional role of the courts to authoritatively determine legal meaning, namely the proper meaning of te tiriti. And this is the thing, right? He's claiming that the courts get to dictate the proper meaning of te tiriti. And I suppose he'll probably make an argument here, which is reasonably... I mean, you look at the role of the judiciary and it is to interpret law and so forth, and one would very much be fair to claim that the Treaty of Waitangi is a legal document, right, that should be interpreted. However, what he's missing is that this bill isn't interpreting te tiriti on behalf of the judiciary. It is clarifying what principles invented by the Parliament of 1975 are. And all that does is shift what is being interpreted. Because, as we've already seen here, the principles did not exist prior to 1975, right? Before 1975, they weren't a thing, and up to that point, no judge was ruling on anything related to the Treaty of Waitangi based on principles. As such, any principles invented from 1975 onwards are not them interpreting a piece of a legal document from 1840. It is then interpreting a law from 50 years ago, and taking really what should be the responsibility of the Parliament or of government, and doing it themselves, and then crying about it when Parliament, who should be responsible for such thing, takes that power back. You see, in 1975, as he alluded to, I think on page 2 or 3, the Waitangi Tribunal Act 1975, the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, was passed. And that made reference to the treaty principles in the preamble. Now, all the government is doing here, or all the ACT Party is trying to do here is clarify what those principles are. The judiciary can't come out now and say that is removing the judiciary's ability to interpret the treaty when the principles that they claim are a fair reflection of the treaty do not, 1, reflect the treaty, and 2, were not a thing until that bill was passed into legislation. So, as far as I'm concerned, this is fair game. It says, a basic principle of our constitutional arrangements is that the courts have the responsibility for determining the meaning of legislation and other instruments. In ordinary circumstances, Parliament can amend legislation if it disagrees with the judicial interpretation, again subject to judicial interpretation of any amendment. However, the bill does not purport to amend or change the treaty itself, and as I explained below, it probably cannot. Rather, the bill seeks to change or codify treaty principles despite their status as derivative norms. The problem is, there is no reason why treaty principles need to exist in the first place. You know, we could just get rid of the treaty principles altogether tomorrow, and the courts could very much just start interpreting the actual text of the treaty outright. That's just a fact. It's just how it is. They could just start interpreting it outright with no reference to principles. In fact, they could arguably just invent principles themselves to use and not have them, used in accordance with the preamble of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, but just simply because they're interpreting a legal document and deciding that these are some principal beliefs or some foundational principles related to that document. And so I also find it interesting that he's saying the basic principle of our constitutional regimes is that the courts have the responsibility of determining the meaning of legislation and other instruments. But the thing with that is, whilst, sure, a legal document you could argue is an other instrument, the treaty itself is not being interpreted by the... Well, not really. It's not really being interpreted by the government here or by the parliament here. Instead, we're just clarifying what principles are. And what we're doing in that is just writing 3 concise principles which are, whilst using different words, are a accurate reflection of what the treaty itself says. So it's not even interpreting the treaty, it's just reflecting what it's saying using different wording. You see, the first principle is rather simple, and it's just talking about how the government has the right to govern over all the land of New Zealand, or has the right to exist. And that's exactly what Article 1 says, so there's no reinterpretation going on here. There is no interpretation. It's merely saying what Article 1 says with different wording. The second article, or the second principle, I should say, really just says that what Article 2 says should be upheld. That's not an interpretation. That is merely saying that what Article 2 of the treaty says is the law, or is a principle. So again, no interpretation, just stating what it says. And then Article 3, again, it doesn't interpret what Article 3 says. The third principle, simply states what Article 3 says using different words. Having the exact same meaning, but using different words. So, his whole argument here is that the Parliament is trying to take away the right of interpreting things from the judiciary, when all that is actually happening is Parliament is clarifying what principles are by outlining the 3, or codifying into law the 3 articles of the treaty using different words. And they have every right to do that because it is their right to create laws. There is no interpretation. There is really nothing there to take issue with. In fact, absolutely everything there is very much in the spirit of, I think, what everyone would have expected at the time. It's certainly, in the modern day, what everyone would want from a nation that they live in. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that the right of the government to govern, in accordance with what Article 1 says, that's what Article 1 says, the rights of Māori and iwi chiefs and other Māori to have the rights that were promised to them in Article 2 being upheld, that's just what Article 2 says. I don't take issue with that. And then Article 3, the rights of everyone to be treated as equals. Again, that is what Article 3 says, just with different words. And if you want to be technical on it, Article 3 says that Māori are given the same rights and duties as British subjects, which it means, in effect, being treated as equals. It follows that the courts must continue to be entitled constitutionally to elaborate the proper legal meaning of the treaty, regardless of any attempt by Parliament to codify meaning in the form of treaty principles. To the extent that the bill seeks to disrupt the determination of this legal meaning by the courts, it is an improper breach of the separation of powers, in my view. And see, this is where he's screwing himself. Because if we're actually trying to argue whether or not the treaty principles, as they are, and used by the Waitangi Tribunal, given the fact that they have been malleable over the years, if he was arguing that the treaty principles are a fair reflection of the treaty and they exist as a means of interpreting the treaty, and that's exactly what they're doing, then that would be fine. If he was arguing that the government was trying to interpret the treaty, and then he might have a point. Now, I did my best I possibly could to argue against that. But what he's doing in the 17th point here is that he's arguing that the Parliament is attempting to codify the meaning of, in the form of the treaty principles. But the Parliament has every right to codify treaty principles because they are the Parliament. They have the right to outline anything like that, so long as it doesn't breach anything. Now, I want to quickly read that again because I did have a train of thought which I briefly lost. It follows that the courts must continue to be entitled constitutionally to elaborate the proper legal meaning of the Treaty of Te Tiriti, regardless of any attempt by Parliament to codify meaning in the form of treaty principles. To the extent that the bill seeks to disrupt the determination of this legal meaning by the courts, it is an improper breach of the separation of powers, in my view. But the problem being is the courts aren't interpreting the treaty in so much as they are interpreting the principles, or they want to have the authority to dictate the principles. The principles exist and have the power they have because of legislation. As such, that legislation can be changed. He can argue against it, but that legislation is an invention of the Parliament. As such, the Parliament should have the right to amend that legislation or to elaborate on that legislation. Without these principles, there would be nothing that the judiciary could be arguing as protection for the Treaty of Waitangi. You see, they didn't create the principles as an interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi just out of the blue. They started doing so because of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975. Without that act, they wouldn't have started interpreting principles the way they are at all. So as far as I'm concerned, the treaty principles are not a interpretation of the treaty in terms of the ones that are currently used, and more so an interpretation or a creation of legislation. So, at the end of the day, it's his view that Parliament should not be dictating principles because he believes that they are interpreting the treaty, whilst at the same time he doesn't actually believe that the actual text should be the basis of any decisions that courts make, but rather any interpretation that the courts make or the interpretation that the courts have made over the last, let's say, 50 years should be what dictates outcomes and decisions in courts and in the creation of legislation and so forth. And so that's my fundamental issue with him, is he doesn't want to respect the actual text, but wants to also leverage the text as a justification for this bill not to pass. He wants to say that the government is taking the text and interpreting it, whilst also saying that he doesn't believe decisions should be made in accordance with the text, but rather principles that academics and and the judges believe the text should actually mean. And when we go and look, if you want to, we can look at what some of the principles actually are and try and see if we can find anything in the actual treaty itself which would justify having said principle. Let's look at the 3 Ps, right? It's partnership, participation, and protection. Now, you could very much argue that protection is a principle in accordance with what the treaty says. But it's not what the treaty says. You could say that, okay, yes, sure, the treaty, in the spirit of the treaty, involves protection of certain rights and all that sort of stuff. But it's not what the treaty itself actually says. So removing that isn't an issue as far as I'm concerned. You remove that and all you're doing is leaving yourself with what the actual text says. There's no interpretation being done there. And the protection aspect of it is fundamentally relevant to Article 2. And as we've already outlined with Act's Bill, Article 2, or the Principle 2, is a reflection of Article 2 by saying that what is protected in Article 2 will remain. Except, of course, when it's inconsistent with treating people equally, except blah, blah, blah. There's a few exceptions there. So, if we look at the principle of protection, that's not remotely affected by the bill anyway. Then you look at partnership. There's no reference to partnership in the treaty at all anyway, so removing that would not be... So the fact that that exists as actually is an interpretation that is nonsensical and a threat to our democracy as far as I'm concerned. But removing that isn't an issue. It's not an issue, objectively speaking, but these people don't like dealing in objectivity. So we can remove that, it's not an issue, and more or less it's being replaced with the Crown has the right to govern. And that's exactly what Article 1 says anyway. So, no interpretation being had, and all it does is rectify a falsehood that is being upheld by the courts and academics for decades. Then what have you got? You got protection, partnership, and participation, is it? I don't bloody know at this point, I always forget. But they are participating, right? And that's, you could argue, upheld by Article 3 in the treaty, where it's talking about how Māori have the same rights and duties under law as British subjects, or that they'll be treated the same as British subjects. And of course, British subjects participate. They participate in our government. They participate in our pretty much everything, right? Everything in our society. And that's what Māori have the right to do in our country in 2025. They have the right to participate. So all of these things are being upheld anyway. And nothing that's being proposed by the Treaty Principles Bill gets in the way of partnership or protection. And it's really just participation against, not participation, it doesn't get in the way of participation and protection. What it does get in the way of is partnership. But the reason it gets in the way of partnership is because partnership is not mentioned anywhere in the treaty. Anywhere. It's a completely ideological invention that has absolutely no business being called a treaty principle. And so it's less that they have an issue. It's less that they have an issue with the fact that the government is interpreting, and I use that loosely because I don't think they're interpreting anything, that they're interpreting the treaty. And it's more the fact that what the government is outlining is fact, and it gets in the way of them making decisions and interpreting law and the treaty the way they want to, in a way that's inconsistent with what the treaty actually says. And so he can gaslight and say that it's undermines the separation of powers. But as far as I'm concerned, what he's doing here, is gaslighting. Nothing more, nothing less. At the heart of his opposition to it, it's that everything about the bill does the opposite of uphold the treaty, and everything that he stands for upholds the treaty, when it's the other way around. He believes that at the end of the day... Okay, I've got a bot on Twitch. Lovely. He believes that at the end of the day, the government of the day should not dictate the treaty principles, that the New Zealand public should not dictate the treaty principles, that the judiciary should. The judiciary should have full control of what the treaty says, irrespective of what it means. They should dictate every principle. They should have full reign to interpret it and amend the interpretation, irrespective of the argument he made. And that's that. Parliament should butt out. Parliament should just accept anything that the judiciary says on this issue. Parliament should accept anything that the academia says on this issue. And Parliament should not pass any laws that are inconsistent with those interpretations. Parliament should not make any decisions that are inconsistent with those interpretations. And any attempt to outline what principles are, any attempt to outline what the treaty says, just to accept what the treaty says, is a breach of the separation of powers. Look, I mumbled my way through that. I stuttered my way through that. But I am no lawyer, okay? I'm no legal expert. But what I do know is that this guy's argument is fundamentally flawed. Fundamentally flawed. And I want to go back and quickly read what I first said. What I first said about it, because it breaks down that in the most concise way possible. He claims to be a legal academic, and this is why legal academics are, or being called a legal academic is meaningless, in my opinion. Because he fundamentally opposes equality in defense of racial separatism, and he does so by arguing falsehoods. And that's why I myself have no interest in going to university, no interest in completing a law degree, no interest in ever sending my kids to a university unless it's absolutely necessary. Until things change. He claims the bill is based on a misunderstanding of the nature of the treaty principles, stating they are not independent amendable norms, rather a legislative cue as to meaning. The problem being the bill quite literally does the latter and rids us of the former. He flat out lies when he claims the bill effectively legislates a legal fiction, yet the only fiction is the current crop of malleable principles that do not reflect the intention of the meaning of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and it is in fact this bill that he so wholeheartedly opposes, which upholds the truth of the matter, which upholds a literal reflection of the Treaty of Waitangi in the form of principles. There is no interpretation here, it is a literal reflection. Different word, sure, but the meaning remains the same. The proposed treaty principles are a reflection of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and that is a fact. Finally, he states that this bill undermines the separation of powers, but last I checked it was not the courts who write the law, it is they who interpret and rule on it. Sure, he elaborates further in his 6-page submission that, it's about, well, technically, the government's trying to interpret the treaty, but they are not. They are outlining what the treaty says in a way that is undeniably consistent with it. There is no interpretation.